Hey, hi, Keely. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for making time for this today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to chat to you. I'm sure we're going to have lots to chat about.
I am already nerding out on all of the things. I don't know where to start. And I was just saying, I can't even imagine how you make time for anything in your schedule. I think that most people would consider just training for the Olympics like a full-time job or a PhD a full-time job, let alone to somehow be doing both. I want to know your secret sauce. That said, the loaded question I always like to start with is how do you keep yourself well with everything you've got going on in your world?
So I think really, while most people are like, this is ridiculous that you train full time for the Paralympic Games, but you're also doing a PhD. But I think having that balance and not wrapping up my identity fully in either one of them really allows me to stay well. When the Paralympics were postponed in 2020 due to COVID, I could have sat there and thrown myself a little pity party because who knows, this thing I've been training for, this pinnacle of my life, what I thought now might not even happen. Instead of doing that, I was able to email my supervisors and say, let's go. I was able to find other purpose in my life. And in doing that, that's allowed me to find purpose outside of maybe what I do professionally. It's allowed me to find more purpose in going for a walk with my dogs, looking at the horizon in Saskatoon when the sun's setting over the river and you can just see the Children's Hospital or the Bessborough on this beautiful Saskatchewan sky. So just it's really allowed me to put things into perspective, I guess, and realize that no matter what's going on in the world, good, bad, it's such a small part of the world when we think of everything.
That's really great insight. And we've talked about the identity of an athlete on this podcast many times and how challenging that can be when, for most people, inevitably there's a retirement at some point as a competitive athlete. So I think you make such a great point to have that very demanding divide of focus, may be beneficial, not only now, but for the future, if and when you do decide to retire, your entire identity is not wrapped up in that. And that said, so you're now preparing for Paris, but you are no stranger to the Olympics, having left Rio with a medal, which is incredible. So how was the process of preparing for that? Do you go tunnel vision leading up to the event, or are you still somehow finding this balance with academia?
Actually, I think the closer I get to the games, the less tunnel vision I need to be because it's so all consuming. Going into the Tokyo games, I'd be going out for a ride and suddenly my mind would be racing with I leave for Tokyo in 4 weeks. This person just won the first medal at the games. I have the opportunity to win the first medal at the games. When really I had to bring myself back into that very moment, be like, no, what can I do in these next 24 hours to
Mm.
best prepare me for what's going to come in Tokyo, to best prepare me for having my best performance at the pinnacle of athletic events in the world. So yeah, the closer I get to a major competition, the less tunnel vision I find is beneficial. I'm going to be so nervous on that day of. I'm going to be probably puking my guts out the day before. And we don't need to extend that into the weeks, the months beforehand. There's going to be enough stress in that moment. And I know that all I can do is take whatever I can do in the next 24 hours to step towards my goals and just really learn to trust the process.
Wow. So performance, do you call it performance anxiety is something you experience? I've experienced performance anxiety even in like minute things, let alone something of this stature. I can't even imagine. So you're aware of it and try to just minimize the length that's affecting you.
Yeah, it's definitely gotten a lot better over the years. For the first probably 3 years of my competitive racing career, I had a full on sobbing, ugly cry the day before a race, like snot rolling down my face. And I always felt so much better after. Like it just had to happen. That was almost like I had to get all those emotions out so that I could be the best version of myself on the day of. And I've gotten better to the point where I can manage these emotions leading up to instead of fighting them, such that it doesn't get to that point.
Hmm.
And some races it's more than others. I can do a World Cup and not be that nervous because in my world a World Cup isn't that big of a deal.
Just
Um,
the World Cup.
But even this past couple weeks ago, I was, as you mentioned, I was in Rio for track world championships. And we went into that race knowing I wasn't ideally prepared. My goal this year is to go fast in Paris. My goal was not to go fast in Rio. Rio was a stepping stage.
Oh,
Rio was a training opportunity, an opportunity to see where everybody else is in the world, to know how we can fine tune training in the next 6 months before the games. And even so, I felt great in my races before my main event. My main event is the individual pursuit. We started racing on Wednesday. My pursuit was on Friday. I felt great Wednesday, Thursday. And on Friday, I just like my entire system shut down. After that day, my roommate was like, Keely, I knew you were nervous because you kept asking if we were on schedule like every 2 minutes. Like it's, and honestly, I didn't perform to the way I would have liked to. And again, we went in knowing that I wasn't set up for ultimate success. That was a decision me and my coach made consciously going into the event. But yeah, it still hits me even. I guess I started racing on the national team in 2018. So 6 years into my competitive career, I've got 6 world championship medals now. I've got 10 World Cup medals. I've got a Paralympic medal. And it's still, before those big events, it hits me. But I always try to tell myself, when I no longer get nervous before a race, it probably means I should have quit one race ago. If I'm nervous, it means I care.
wow. That's a great mindset. Well, and I mean, it maybe sounds cliche, but I think we all hear that, oh, excitement and nervous, it feels the same, it spurs the same thing. So embracing that. But that's great. Have you worked with, or is part of your team a sports psychologist, or is this all just been progress that you've made on your own?
Yeah, I worked with a couple of different mental performance consultants. I worked with Leah Ferguson from the College of Kinesiology here at the U of S, and that was really great for getting me started on my sport journey
Mm.
as a new athlete, figuring out how to handle the pressure of wearing the maple leaf on my back, because as a new athlete, that is a lot of pressure. And when you're still trying to make it, and every mistake seems like it's the end of the world, and this is going to be the thing that stops you from reaching your goal. And then later on, more recently, working with Val Had, who is the Cycling Canada mental performance consultant, who's really, as somebody who understands the sport a little bit more, is able to maybe put things into perspective a little bit and just be a little bit more specific, because she does know the sport. She knows the context of the team. She knows the context of importance.
Yeah. Amazing that you have that support. And so you kind of were purposely taking the foot off the gas a little bit for Rio, getting ready to like slingshot forward. So how, if at all, does your prep change for now going into Paris? Do you take a different approach? Is the scheduling the same and it's just a level of intensity?
So my prep looks probably a lot different than a lot of other cyclists, particularly if you're considering able-bodied cyclists, because I do track and road cycling, which are, for all intents and purposes, two very different sports. On the able-bodied side, nobody's going to race track and road at the games.
Oh,
Um, very few will race track and road even at the world championships level.
wow.
But the nature of para is, because we have less athletes, there does tend to be a little bit of a double focus. It's all under the umbrella of paracycling. But because my main event in track cycling is, it better be less than 4 minutes, like usually about 3 minutes, 50 seconds. Whereas my main event on the road is a 40-minute, 20-kilometer time trial. So those are two very different demands on my body. And
Yeah.
now that track world is over from March, I leave for Europe in May for World Cup. So we've got about a month to turn me from a power track cyclist into an endurance road cyclist. And then we've got to walk a fine line and find a balance, because I'm going to focus on both track and road going into the Paris Paralympic Games. The focus will still be on the track, because that does tend to be where I find more success. That does tend to be where I perform better. But we do still need to, we can't train for track while throwing all the fitness for road out of the way. So we do need to find that balance of maximizing both to the best that we can.
Mm-hmm. And do you find like the mental preparation for those like very different distance, like times and distances is quite different as well?
They are, but really at the end of the day, they're the same energy system. They're both endurance sports. Sorry, as I get nerdy on exercise physiology here.
Please
I
do.
mean, it's different on different ends of the spectrum of the endurance, whether it's just barely aerobic versus entirely aerobic, but it is still the same energy system. And really, for both of them, you are just sitting on that line of, I can barely hold this. It's just I can barely hold this for more than 3 minutes 50 seconds, or I can barely hold this for 40 minutes. The goal in both of those events is to be all but falling off my bike at the end of it.
That's a good go, like that's the upper echelon. That's amazing. For those who don't know, myself included, I am very new to all of this. Can you explain the difference in the bikes that you ride versus the bike that, as you said, like an able-bodied person is riding?
Yeah, so my track bike is actually the same as what anybody without a physical impairment might have. And for those who don't know, so I had a brain injury when I was 15. So clinically speaking, I'm a left side spastic hemiplegic, which means the left side of my body just doesn't work that well. I have some sort of function in the entire left side of my body, but I have very poor dexterity in my left hand. I have poor mobility, poor coordination. So that where that affects me the most is my road bikes, because if anybody rides bikes, you shift and you brake with both hands. On the track, those bikes actually have no gears nor any brakes, so my bike looks the exact same as anybody else's. The way we set up my particularly handlebars is a little bit different because I don't have the same range of motion as another person might. So we just we have to play with the handlebars a little bit to make sure that left arm is comfortable. But my track bike looks the same as anybody else on the team. Whereas my road bike, we have some adaptations. So both of my brakes run off one lever, which means I can't feather my brakes left or right. I can't play with it to get an optimal stopping. When I'm pulling a lever, both brakes are going at the same time. I also have, anybody in the cycling community knows, we call it DI2, which is just electronic shifting. So instead of pushing my lever to shift gears, I just press a button. And then I've got a satellite box, I guess you could call it, for my other derailleur. So I can work both derailleurs, both shifting front and back off one hand.
Wow, there's so many moving parts to all this. It's fascinating. So different athletes then would have different customizations done to their bike based on what's necessary.
Yeah, that's right. And that's kind of the cool thing about cycling, I find, is regardless of the impairment in the world of parasport, there's a cycling discipline for you. So in cycling, we have the C class, which ride what appear to be normal bikes, two-wheeled bikes like you would buy in a store, and then there may or may not be adaptations based on what an individual needs. There's hand bikes for people, maybe they're a double leg amputation, maybe they have a spinal cord injury, they propel bikes with their hands. There's tricycles for people with severe balance impairments. And then there's tandem bikes for visually impaired athletes. So it's a pretty neat, very accessible sport where even if you weren't able to do some sort of other activity, there's a bike for you.
That is so amazing. And how did you end up choosing paracycling? Because as you said, you had this accident in 2009, so you're 15, and then didn't start competing in cycling until 2016. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I was in all the sports growing up. Typical farm kid from Saskatchewan. I played hockey, I played volleyball, badminton, I raced motocross. If it was offered, I did it. And like hockey was kind of my main sport. And I had these big dreams of playing university hockey, playing Olympic hockey, the whole 9 yards. And then when I was 15, I got hurt and I could still play hockey. I did continue to play hockey, but I was definitely not the player I used to be. I can't really hold on to my stick that well with one of my hands. I can't do a full stride length with one of my legs. Naturally makes competing at the highest level in ice hockey rather challenging. But I continued to play and I continued to be active. And then one day I was in university and a fellow classmate came up to me in the gym and was like, so I heard about your accident and I've kind of seen you move and I think you'd be classifiable for parasport. And she starts telling me about parasport and how you can travel the world and I'll help pay for your tuition and you'll be provided coaches and telling me all these great things. And I'm like, if you want, come with me to see my sports scientist. So I went with her to see Bruce Craven, who is a physiotherapist here in the city, does a lot of work with various different high-level athletes in Olympic and Paralympic sport. He kind of put me on a treadmill, watched me walk, watched me squat, what have you. And he said, you're definitely classifiable, pick a sport. At that point in time, it was December, I believe. So I was like, let's try cross country skiing. And that lasted one session. It was hard. It was cold. I was really bad. So that was a short-lived endeavor.
That would be me just based on the cold.
Yeah, pretty much. And then I had a bike, like a $200 steel frame Canadian Tire bike that I'd been riding back and forth to school. And I'd heard we had a decent coach here in the Saskatoon area. So I was like, maybe I can do cycling. This is something, it's an individual sport, so hopefully I wouldn't have to move my whole life in order to compete in a team sport. I've got the basic equipment. Let's give it a try. So that would have been, I met with Bruce the winter of 2014. 2015, I kind of started quote unquote training on this steel frame Canadian tire bike. I use air quotes there because my long rides were 20 kilometers, which anybody who is a avid cyclist knows that's a warm up. Um, and then when I finished my undergrad degree in 2016, I bought myself my first good road bike as a graduation present to myself. And I started getting into the cycling culture a little bit more. I started doing group rides. I started going out for 50, 60-kilometer rides. And then in 2017, I was like, you know what? If we're going to do this, we have to actually race a bike. If I want to race bikes, I need to enter a race. So I entered my very first race in Moose Jaw, just a local provincial race. And I immediately fell in love with the sport, like right from the get-go. I hadn't even gone yet, just being in the pen with all the other athletes. Everybody was so welcoming. And like I kind of, this hole in my heart that had been left since I stopped playing hockey competitively suddenly filled up. It
Mm.
was the brute physicality, the community, everything. Just, I felt like myself again. And after that race, I went on the Canadian Paralympic Committee's website and I found every single email that was listed on that website. And I cold emailed them all saying, I have a brain injury and I like to bike. What can I do? And from there, they put me in touch with Cycling Canada. I was invited out for a training camp. I did my first nationals in 2017. And by 2018, I was at World Championships.
Wow. And just everything changed based on that recommendation. I think about that ripple effect of like just that moment of your classmate walking up to you and saying that, like, imagine how different your life would have been. Were you already on the path to study exercise physiology at that time, or what was your undergrad?
Yeah, so my undergrad was in kin, and I kind of took every physiology course I could. That was where my interests lie.
Cool. So that just all, and do you think that was inspired partially by your injury?
I don't necessarily think it was inspired by my injury. I just, again, growing up, physical activity sport was what I did.
Mm.
Hockey was really like my life, and everything school, friends, family existed in the periphery. Which then, obviously, when I couldn't play hockey at the same level, I realized why we need to have multiple facets in our life.
Mm.
But it was always sport, physical activity. That's where I feel the most like myself. That's where that's my happy place. I was even thinking as it's finally getting nice here in Saskatoon, and I was able to get my road bike out for some rides this week. And it really dawned on me like this is where I am the best version of myself, and I can be outside, moving my body, existing in nature, and yeah, just getting some sort of physical activity. That's always been where I feel most like myself.
And at 15, did you struggle with that identity shift, no longer feeling like your highest self as an athlete, not being able to perform to the same extent?
Yeah, I would definitely, without a doubt, say that at 15, I had an identity crisis. And that might sound hyperbolic, but 100% that's what happened.
Mhm.
Before I got hurt, I'd introduce myself and I'd say, hi, I'm Keely, I'm a hockey player.
Mhm.
And that was the entirety of who I was.
Mhm.
And then again, I had these big lofty goals of university hockey, Olympic hockey. And then at one point it dawned on me after I got hurt that I'm not the same player I was. I was playing double A hockey, relatively high level hockey when I got hurt. And I went back to try out for the team the next season and I didn't make it.
Ugh.
And it didn't matter what I did. My body doesn't work the same way it used to. But
Mhm.
my 15-year-old brain couldn't comprehend that. I thought I just needed to do more. I needed to work harder. And
Mhm.
this actually caused me to spiral into a series of mental health issues. I was diagnosed with anorexia almost a year to the day of being discharged from the rehab hospital for my brain injury. And that was something I continued to struggle with for many years as I tried to find out who I was because when I didn't have hockey anymore,
Mhm.
I didn't know who I was as a person. I didn't know what my purpose was. I didn't know what my life would hold.
Mhm. Oh, and so controlling what you can, which is super common in youth, and one of those things being, what you're putting into your body. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's so heavy on top of already what you're handling. So, how did you end up moving forward in recovery with your eating disorder?
So I would say I was diagnosed in 2011. And it was I have no doubt in saying that cycling probably saved my life from my eating disorder, because I really walked that fine line for a very long time of being very ill. I was hospitalized once for my eating disorder, and then I kind of learned how to walk that line between. I never had a good relationship with food, but I wasn't sick enough to be hospitalized. I walked that line like a pro. And then when I realized that cycling was something I could pursue and something that might take me somewhere, I found that I cared more about that and I cared more about the sport than I did about that voice in my head. And I knew that regardless of how much I didn't want that whatever meal, however bad of a day it was, I didn't want that. I knew I couldn't ride the next day if I didn't feel my body. I knew that listening to that little anorexic voice in my head and training my bike at the level I needed to were not compatible. I had to pick one.
How powerful to know you had a bigger purpose to nourish yourself for.
Yeah, and that's not that's I shouldn't have need a reason to nourish myself, of course, right? But it was the stepping stones to start moving in a more healthy direction until I could realize that nourishing myself was
Mhm.
important over and above what I could do on the bike. But it was just that stepping stone I needed to move in the right direction of recovery.
Oh, that's incredible. I'm so grateful to know that you were able to move through that. And I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the myths and misconceptions about para athletes and athletics. I feel like for a lot of people, this is kind of new territory if it's their first time listening. So, any examples that you can give us of myths and misconceptions that you come across regularly?
I'm so glad you're bringing this up. So I teach a class quite often on nutrition for para athletes, and the first couple slides are always what is a para athlete, because typically when people think of para athletes, they think of wheelchair athletes, and they might think of people with amputations. But the world of para athletes goes so far beyond that. Usually, when people first see me and I say I'm a para athlete, you can see the gears working in their mind, and you can see them trying to figure out how to ask, "What's wrong with you?" um, because I don't look like I have an impairment. Most people wouldn't know unless you know what to look for. So I would say the first thing is that the realm of para athletes, the scope of para athletes, goes far beyond what most people would think of. And I think the next thing is too that disability and impairment is not static. It changes from day to day, from moment to moment, from year to year, even if you don't have a degenerative condition. So for me, my spasticity and the amount of control really I have over that side of my body varies a lot based on stress and physical exertion. So when I finish a race, from the amount of tension I had to put through my muscles, the just degree of effort that I put into that race, regardless of how long it was, I convulse. My whole body, it looks like I'm having a seizure, because it's almost like my nerves don't know what to do and everything just fires sporadically and randomly. In 2023, we had this really cool super world championships where all of the cycling disciplines raced together. So para, able-bodied, road, track, mountain bike, what have you. So we were in the same pit warming up at the same time as the able-bodied track athletes. And they all had to be debriefed that the para athletes are going to come off and it's going to look scary. It's going to look strange, but everybody's safe. It's okay. Because a lot of us do, we shake, we convulse. Um, and everybody's very different. So even if you've got two people with a brain injury, they might present very different. They might react to different activities or stresses very differently. And then I think another, I don't want to say myth or anything, but to assume that just because somebody has an impairment means really anything there's something they can't do is the height of hubris. To say, I remember once I was working for the School of Rehab Therapy, and I was setting up one of their continuing education courses. And I was talking to the instructor that they had brought in, and we got talking about how I had a brain injury, and I was doing my master's degree. And he looked at me and he was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, but brain injury, you mean a concussion?" I was like, "No, I had a moderate to severe brain injury. Here was kind of my path." And then he looked at me and he was like, "So you have this brain injury, but you are also doing your master's." It was almost like this was incomprehensible that I could have brain injury and be pursuing higher education. When I was lucky that my cognitive facilities were not, or faculty, sorry, were not impacted by my brain injury. There's no reason why, as somebody with a brain injury, I can't pursue higher education. I've actually think I've shown that I was able to do so, and I was able to do so quite well. I just got note that my PhD thesis was one of the top 2 in the entire university. Um,
Wow.
and then to think that, oh, just because my hand doesn't work, typically the way we do things might look different, but we can definitely still do them. We just adapt based on how we can do things. And I think just listening to each individual about how they need to perform whatever task it is, almost everybody can find a way to get things done, right? We adapt, our lives adapt based on what we need.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure daily you're facing those kind of biases that people have, and maybe are not even self-aware that they have. Like this individual sounds like they didn't realize they had a bias of what a brain injury means. It can look so many different ways. So I know you had mentioned, when you mentioned that you're a para athlete, to someone, you kind of see their gears turning as they analyze. May I ask, is there an appropriate way to ask someone what's wrong with them? If you're saying, like, introducing yourself as, I'm a para athlete, are you comfortable with someone asking, what is your limitation? What happened? Or how do we bridge those conversations? Should we bridge those conversations? Is it our place to ask? Curiosity
Absolutely.
versus nosiness, I think.
It is a fine line to walk. And I think the question of what's wrong with you is not the way to do it, because
Yes,
I don't think there's anything wrong with me. My body
exactly.
moves different. That doesn't mean it's wrong. But I think to ask, what is your limitation, or what is your impairment, or what makes you classifiable?
Mm,
I'm very happy to have that conversation. Now,
okay.
I think being in conversation with somebody, they've mentioned they're a para athlete, and asking is very different than seeing somebody with an amputation or in a wheelchair and walking up and saying, what happened?
Right.
Right? Like it would be like if somebody had a big black eye, they're walking around the streets. A stranger's not just going to walk up and say, what happened?
Mhm.
Again, it's one thing if you're already in conversation with that person, to ask a little bit more. But yeah,
Right.
I think just understand, like, again, what's wrong with you, not the way to do it, but genuine curiosity. I have no problem sharing my story, because I do think I'm a good example of breaking any sort of stigmas around brain injuries, because I'm a high functioning individual. I go faster than some of the able-bodieds on my bike. I have a PhD. So I think I take that job very seriously, of
Mhm.
being a role model, being an example of what a brain injury can be, even though as we're sitting on this call, my left leg is shaking and I have no control over it.
Wow. I really appreciate those verbal cues, because I think that we are so scared to have conversations for fear of saying the wrong thing. So if we can do it from a respectful place out of curiosity, that really invites people to understand more and learn more. And I say it all the time, I would rather try to ask the question out of a good place. And if I need to ask for forgiveness because I did it in a clunky way, that's how we learn. This podcast is a great place for this. So I appreciate that so much. And I mean, and identifying yourself as a para athlete, I think that does, it invites that positive bridge for those conversations. And so you mentioned that you do a nutrition course specifically for para athletes. Nutrition is my bread and butter nerd out subject. So I would love to know, how does nutrition potentially differ for para athletes? What are you teaching in that course, and what part does nutrition play in your role of fueling yourself these days?
Yeah, so a lot of my class in nutrition, I've taught it when I taught sport nutrition. I also have taught it the last 3 or 4 years to incoming dietitians in the College of Nutrition, and it's always been really well received. And a lot of what I try to teach in that class is nuance. I mean, like anything nutrition related and impairment related, anything human related, really, there's always going to be nuance in it. So I try to steer the students' brains about the nuance that needs to be considered. So a big one I touch on is energy expenditure. People with some para athletes might have reduced energy expenditure because they have less muscle mass due to paralysis. Some might have higher energy expenditure because they are inefficient movers. They're spastic as they run. They're just biomechanics aren't what we would consider ideal. Obviously, people on the podcast can't listen, but I just use air quotes on ideal. I also talk a lot about how having reduced muscle mass, because that is the big limitation that a lot of para athletes face, whether that's due to paralysis, limb amputations, or limb deficiencies, just less muscle mass, that is going to impact not only energy expenditure, but that's going to impact their glycogen storage ability and therefore what fueling needs to look like before, during, and after exercise. That's going to impact how they handle lactate. People with spinal cord injuries typically don't sweat, or they don't sweat as efficiently. So now thermal regulation is an issue. And managing that, people with cerebral palsy often produce more body heat than an able-bodied individual, but they sweat the same amount. So they're getting a higher thermal load of core temperature. And how can we manage that? Um, and then the role of supplements. Obviously, supplements are a big thing. And there's a lot of emerging research that shows para athletes don't respond the same way to supplements. So something like caffeine, people with paraplegia, so that's typically going to be paralysis from the belly button or so down, they tend to need a lower dose of caffeine in order to get the same peak plasma caffeine response. Whereas people with quadriplegia or tetraplegia, which means a impact of all four limbs, they tend to be slower caffeine metabolizers. So they should be consuming their ergogenic aid, caffeine, further out from exercise, as opposed to the 30 to 45 minutes we would say for an able-bodied individual. It seems that para athletes need a higher or a longer loading phase for creatine in order to get that saturation and get the benefits. And really the thing is with para athletes is we know so little about them, but particularly those with spinal cord injuries, their autonomic nervous system doesn't work the same way. So how they feel after they eat, whether or not, because they're sitting and that lack of autonomic nervous function, they might feel a lot more bloated and kind of gassy, and they don't have, their gut mobility is different. So um, their bowel habits tend to be different, which is going to impact what they want to eat, how they eat. And with that, we see reduced fiber intakes in a lot of these athletes. And we know that fiber is super important for health, for the gut microbiome. And we know people with spinal cord injuries tend to have a dysbiosis in their gut anyways. So it's kind of this interplay of how can we best manage the symptoms that they are dealing with while optimizing their intake. And that's really, you kind of have to give and take a little bit, but how can we give and how can we take to best set up these individuals for performance?
Well, and it just is so broad and vast because, as you've mentioned, there's so many varying limitations that could be occurring. Like just that umbrella of nutrition for para athletes feels so incredibly broad, as you said, like just so nuanced as we know nutrition for any individual. What is your personal approach to nutrition?
So I have to be very careful because sometimes I can get so into the black and white textbook nutrition science because I know it. But also, and that's great because I mean, then I can feel optimally. But then I also have to do some introspection of, okay, you know what? I've hit these numbers, but I'm also doing a volume block and my legs feel super heavy. So maybe I need more of X, Y, Z. I know that, okay, there's not necessarily evidence for this, but I feel great when I like, for personally, I've been using taurine recently, and I find from a cognition perspective, I take it and I look at my husband and I'm like, is this what normal people feel like? Um, so it's kind of a trial and error of what feels best for me. So I'm not always the best of putting the nutritional guidelines into place. You know, background of disordered eating habits, those die pretty hard. But it's also, I try to make sure that I'm fueling for the work required. And that's going to look different whether I'm focused on track cycling at the moment, which is a very power based sport, higher emphasis on protein intakes, or if I'm focusing on road, which is going to be a more endurance based. So now I need to have a little bit more carbohydrate in my diet.
Interesting. And do you schedule in a lot of downtime, a lot of recovery time, time for mindfulness, days where you're not training or working on academia, or are you kind of just rotating that focuses day to day?
So I would say both and. It's to me, I'm very much a morning person. My brain shuts off at about 3 in the afternoon. But every morning, most mornings, I wake up, I make a cup of tea, and I sit on the couch and I read a book. I cuddle with my dog and I drink my tea. I will wake up an hour earlier than I need to ensure that I have that time because that is my time. That is kind of my slow start. That's when I just get to exist before all of the asks of the world, I guess, hit me. And then as far as like mindfulness, I was meeting with a neuropsychologist at one point, and he was like, Keely, have you ever tried meditation mindfulness? And I kind of looked at him, I said, yeah. And he's like, it doesn't work for you, does it? I kind of, no, it doesn't. He's like, yeah, you don't strike me as someone who does well just sitting there. But that's where I find states of mindfulness and states of fully being in myself when I'm on my bike. When I go out for 2, 3, 4 hour rides that are just putting in the time, really, I'm not doing efforts. I'm just out and I get to notice the skyline that never ends that we get here in Saskatchewan. I get to notice the colors of the field. I get to notice the reflection of downtown Saskatoon on the river. It's all these things, all these noticings. And my brain just, it gets to work through all these different things. And I work through everything in my mind so much better when I'm moving. So that mindfulness really comes as part of my training, which I'm maybe is why I'm good at cycling, because that's how I work through everything in my mind is through movement and through just being able to move is really what works best for me. I tend to full days off are quite a rarity in my world because it's pretty uncommon for me to have a day off training and work at the same time. The joys of academia is you can work whenever you want. The downside of academia is you can work whenever you want. And there always seems to be a list of things that need to be done. But every now and then I will email my coach and I'll be like, I need a day off on the weekend because I need a day of just doing nothing. And that's not something I can justify during the week when I've got emails coming in and papers due and XYZ. But my coach is so great in that if I were to say I need a weekend day off, he probably would give me two. And he's flat out said, like, even if it's structured in, take the day off. He doesn't care. We are so fortunate at the paracycling team as Cycling Canada that our coach sees us as humans before he sees us as athletes, which I think is quite uncommon in the world of elite sport. But I also think is why we have a very successful team.
Well, and I can imagine leads to way greater performance and longevity for athletes long term as it is. And can I ask, are you wearing an Aura ring?
I am wearing an Aura ring. Yep.
So do you help use that to gauge when your body's telling you like, okay, it's a scheduled training day, but I need a day off?
I wouldn't say I use it, honestly. For cycling, I have to take my heart rate every morning. So it used to be before I had the Aura ring that the alarm would go off, I'd put a heart rate monitor on, and then I'd have to lay there for 5 minutes. So the Aura ring just is a lot more conducive to my life of being able to get up, have that cup of tea, and sit with my dog. I think my husband also likes it too because I'm not laying in bed for another 5 minutes while the dogs are jumping on him because they want to go outside and have breakfast. But I don't like using technology to guide how I'm feeling. I think the Aura ring is way more receptive and way more specific compared to other sensors I've used as far as adequately reflecting what my body feels like. But I will always take what my body feels like, what my brain feels like, over what a piece of technology tells me.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. What else have you used? Like Whoop Strap, Fitbit?
I've mostly used the Aura and I've got a Garmin watch.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got a Garmin bike computer too, which will give me a little bit of feedback around exercise, beginning and the end of my workout. But Aura is really, I got my first Aura ring in 2020 when they were quite new. And I've kind of stuck with it. I try not to get too caught up into the world of wearables and technology because I'm a bit of a numbers person and I can over focus on everything. And as a cyclist, I have enough heart rate data, power to mass data, speed, hours. I have enough data to go off that I probably don't need too much more.
I think that's a good reminder for everyone listening. Sometimes I say that I take it away like a Apple Watch from my clients. I'm like, I think this is diminishing returns. Like too much information is not always necessary. So that's amazing. And so how do your Saskatchewan roots play into your training? Because your training is based out of Quebec, you mentioned, but because you're an individual athlete, you can train anywhere. So how does that relationship work? How often do you have to travel? Do you have to travel? Are you just traveling for competition?
Yeah, so it varies a little bit depending on where we're at in the quad referring to a 4-year cycle leading up to a Paralympic Games. During the summer, I typically only travel for races because I'm usually during the summer I'm focused on road cycling and I can train road cycling no matter kind of wherever I am. During the months of October till March, I tend to travel a little bit more back and forth to Quebec because track cycling happens on a very specific track. It's called a velodrome. It's an indoor, it's almost like a running track. It's 250 meters long, but it's banked. So the corners are usually banked at about 37 to 39 degrees, depending on the track. So that's a very specific infrastructure that you need. And Bromont, Quebec is where we train out of now. It has one. So I go out for anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks a month usually, just to spend some time on the boards because driving is such a huge part of success in track cycling, and you can't get the feeling of driving a track bike. You can't get the feeling of riding a bike that's fixed gear and that is direct drive. So as long as the back wheel's moving, my pedals are also moving. That's very different than a typical bike or a bike I would train on. So there are just some specificities of track cycling that lead me to have to travel a little bit more. But as far as road cycling goes, I can train that wherever I am. In fact, sometimes I think training here in Saskatchewan is a benefit because I have the wind to deal with, and the wind is it's a mental challenge for sure that has shown to it's allowed me some success. I think when we go to things like Belgium where it's really windy and people don't know how to handle the wind, and I feel quite at home in the wind.
Like this Belgium one's got nothing on
Yeah.
Saskatchewan. Oh, what a great point. I never would have thought of that. That's so interesting. And so you were training as an athlete, doing your undergrad. At what point did you say, like, I'm going to do my PhD on top of that? Was that always part of the plan? You knew you wanted to go kind of to the highest level of academia?
It's actually kind of a funny story because when I was doing my undergrad, I'd always said if I go back to school after this, it'll be for a professional degree. It'll be for physio, it'll be for occupational therapy, it'll be for medicine. I actually had a professor who called me into her office in my third year and said, Keely, have you ever thought about grad school? You'd make an excellent grad student. And I told her, I have no intentions of going back to school for the sake of going back to school. And I applied to physio after I took a year off. I applied to physio after my undergrad. At that point, I was working 60 hours a week between a research assistant and personal training. I was working for the city at the same time. I never actually wanted to be a physio. I just thought that that's what people did. I didn't necessarily know what life looked like for me professionally after my undergrad. And I didn't get in, and I thank my lucky stars now that I didn't. But with that, I was kind of like, okay, well, I didn't get into physio, what now? So I applied to my master's. I think I probably applied about 3 minutes before applications for that upcoming fall term closed. And then it was kind of like, well, I'll do my master's and I'll see. Because I'd been working as a research assistant for who became my supervisor, Phil Chillibeck, for a while. And I realized actually that the only job I'd ever had that I liked was research. So I applied to my master's and I was kind of like, well, we'll see what happens. And then maybe I'll do my PhD. I'll do my master's in a year and a half. I'll do my PhD in 3 years. We'll just get up and onwards and we'll see what happens. And then I signed my first Cycling Canada contract for 6 weeks into starting my master's degree.
Yeah.
And I was about 6 months into my master's degree, and I was like, I'm racing bikes and going to grad school. This is pretty awesome. Why would I want to expedite this? And then I think it was around that point when I stopped living so far in the future of I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And it was just what now? And then I think that was really important for me to figure out my master's as I moved into my PhD. Because a master's does not prepare you for a PhD. I thought I was ready, but I was not. When you go into a PhD, you have so much more responsibility. You have so many other things to juggle. I personally took on a lot of projects over and above my PhD work. I think I finished my PhD with 17 published articles or something, 8 of which were first author. And that
And
really comes down to I
and
had
how
an
many years?
excellent advisory committee who invited me and involved me in different things. And then that would connect me with other people who liked my work. So they'd ask me to do other things. Um, and then, yeah, I realized that research is what I love. I'm a learner. My husband once called me know it all. And he was like, it's not that you think you know it all. It's just that you want to know it all.
It's like, and you actually do know it all. That's incredible. So how many years was your master's and then how many years was your PhD?
So my master's I started in the September of 2017 and I defended in November of 2019, so just over 2 years. And then my PhD I did in 3 years and 11 months.
And you're like, and I know the minute that it was submitted. So, what was your thesis topic for each of those?
So my thesis area generally was always sport nutrition, but it did change a little bit from my master's to my PhD. My master's looked at dark chocolate and how dark chocolate impacted exercise performance at altitude. So I went down to Regina and I put a bunch of cyclists in an altitude chamber and I fed them a bunch of chocolate to see what would happen. And then I switched gears a little bit for my PhD, whereas my master's was really focused on performance. My PhD work looked more at health. So I worked with some researchers out of the College of Agriculture who had developed a particular brand of field pea that was low in anti-nutrients. So a lot of your plant-based foods, your cereal grains, your lentils, your pulses, they have a lot of nutrients, but they also have what are colloquially known as anti-nutrients.
Mm.
And these anti-nutrients can bind to your essential minerals like iron, magnesium, zinc, and then your body can't absorb it. So these field peas that were bred and grown in Saskatoon were low in the compound phytic acid. And because they were low in phytic acid, that means your body could actually access and absorb the iron that was found in these field peas. And I used that as a strategy to hopefully improve iron deficiency. And I looked at female runners because female runners tend to be disproportionately affected by iron deficiency, as well as individuals with spinal cord injuries. And then it kind of goes, my overall thesis goes a little bit beyond that because I think our peas delivered a relatively small amount of iron compared to a traditional supplement. But there are some environmental benefits of these peas as well, because this phytic acid also is a storage form of phosphorus, and most animals that only have one stomach can't digest it, so then it gets excreted. There's more phosphorus that gets run off into lakes and rivers, and then you get an overgrowth of algae, which then has further effects on ecosystems and ecosystem health. So if that phytic acid isn't storing that phosphorus and the phosphorus is available, the animals actually absorb it, which means that farmers don't have to supplement phosphorus. They don't need to supplement these other essential minerals as much for their livestock. And similarly, in humans, we can actually absorb this. And peas are a particularly interesting vehicle, I guess, for that from an environmental standpoint, because field peas are what we call nitrogen fixators. They put nitrogen back into the soil, whereas a lot of other crops will take nitrogen out of the soil, and that's why we need to fertilize. Peas put nitrogen back into the soil to reduce the need for fertilization.
Wow. Oh my gosh, how interesting. And I mean, I'm just dying to know what the results of the chocolate study were.
That's usually the question, but did it help?
Sorry, I do
So
care about the peas, but I also care about the dark chocolate.
yes. So what we found was we had these cyclists cycle for an hour and a half steady state, and then they did a 10-kilometer time trial. And we found reduced lactate accumulation in the dark chocolate group compared to the control group. There was no difference in performance of the time trial, but there was lower lactate accumulation. So our thought there is that this might be something that's more beneficial in an event that's a little bit punchier, for want of a better word. So it might be like a road cycling race that is 200 kilometers Tour de France style, where there are attacks and there's short bursts of really high intensity, or there's hills, because then maybe your body's not producing as much lactate or it's not accumulating as much lactate during those short punchy periods, which means you can recover better for the next time.
And were you basing it on like a percentage of dark chocolate, or what was the dose? What's the dark chocolate dose?
Where's the money here? So we used a 72% dark chocolate just because it was readily available, really. The whole theory behind this is just the polyphenols, the epicachins in dark chocolate, some of those antioxidants that then allow your body to produce more nitric oxide, which allows your blood vessels to expand and contract more appropriately with exercise and daily life, which means more oxygen, more nutrients, more blood can get to the working muscle, and your muscular waste products can leave the muscle more efficiently. So yeah, we used a 72% dark chocolate, and people were consuming 120 grams a day, split over 2 doses for 2 weeks. So the average normal size chocolate bar is 100 grams, so just a little bit over a regular size chocolate bar a day, which obviously is more than we would recommend for health from a nutritional standpoint. But when you're trying something new, and this dark chocolate theory was relatively new, you kind of need to hyperdose it to see if there's anything there, and then you can start to fine tune what the minimal effective dose is.
Oh, I think that's the funnest research experiment you could have been a participant in. So I'm sure you had.
It's funny that you say that because everybody says that. And then, so it was a crossover design. They did their 2 weeks of chocolate, 2 weeks off, and then they did 2 weeks of the control, and then it was randomized. So it was a crossover study. And some of my people were finishing up around Easter, and they were like, Keely, one of the great things about this is I have no desire to eat all the Easter candy.
Yeah, I mean, like, don't want to look at chocolate ever
Too
again.
much of a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. And so the moment you submit your master's, and again, you know exactly what day, time, hour, minute that was, like, what is the feeling of that? Because I know even when I finish like finals for a semester, I feel lost the next day. I'm like, oh, what am I supposed to be doing? Like, what do I do with these times? So, did you allow yourself some time off? Did you immediately continue on to the next step of research? Did you? I hope you took a
So
holiday.
I'm kind of a bit of a sadist, I think, masochist, whatever the one means you like putting harm on yourself. I was already taking, I knew I was doing my PhD after my master, so I was already taking meetings in October when I defended in November, and then I started my PhD formally in January. So I kind of went directly from my master's into my PhD. And then my PhD, I submitted my final thesis on December 14th, and I started my postdoc at the University of Calgary on January 8th. So there's not a lot of downtime, I would say. But the thing is, I thoroughly enjoy research. Like, I'm not one of those people who could just sit. I talked to my coach and I debated not working in the year before the games. I knew I was going to finish up my PhD at the end of 2023. And then obviously the games are in August, September of 2024. So I debated not working, not taking a position. And my coach looked at me and he was like, Keely, do you think you could just like sit and only train full time? It's like, honestly, probably not. And he's like, no, no, you couldn't. You're going to need to do something. That's just who I am. I like to be busy. Um, I like to, I like to do.
Well, I think it's a testament to finding something that you love. Had you ended up in physiotherapy, you probably would not have felt that way by the sounds of it. And so you mentioned you like really took away like living in the moment, kind of one day at a time. That said, do you have any plans for the other side of Paris, or it's literally just what's on the menu for that day, like one day at a time leading up to that prep?
I've spent so much time of my competitive career, and I think as athletes, we're always looking towards the next world championships, we're looking towards the next games. That I'm looking forward to just focusing on Paris and not worrying about what comes next. Um, I don't want to put that kind of pressure on myself, and I just want to enjoy a Paralympic Games experience in Tokyo. We definitely didn't have a traditional Paralympic Games experience because of the pandemic.
Mhm.
Don't get me wrong, I think the organizers did an absolutely incredible job as far as allowing the games to happen during a global pandemic, but it still wasn't a typical games experience. So I'm really looking forward to having that typical games experience. We've got such a great team. My best friends are on the cycling team. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that with some of these athletes. Some of them, it's their first game, some of them it won't be. So yeah, I'm just focused on Paris and not necessarily worried about what comes next.
I'm glad. I'm glad to hear that. And I would love to know, I mean, I know you enjoy the tea, the time with the dogs, reading, anything else that you do that brings you joy when you're not working and training. And what kind of reading? Do you give yourself time for nonfiction or sorry, fiction, or are you like nonfiction, personal development, always learning?
So my reading, there, I either read like a 14-year-old teenage girl or I read like an academic. There's not much in between. So my reading is quite varied. I do read a lot. I shouldn't say a lot, but I read some nonfiction, personal development, general knowledge books, just because, again, want to know it all. But also, I spend a lot of time reading very complex things in scientific articles. I spend a lot of time thinking at a very high level. That sometimes I want a book that allows my brain to shut off and just entertains me. So, like, think Harry Potter. There's a lot of that. In fact, when I'm in between books and I haven't been able to hit the library, I just restart a Harry Potter book. But like that general young adult fantasy, that's where I spend a lot of my time because again, I spend so much time with heavy high level thinking and reading very complex things. But sometimes I just want to be entertained.
I love that. I'm glad. I'm glad you give yourself a break. Well, and you're multifaceted. You know, you can do both. You can be the academic and still enjoy Harry Potter. And for those listening, if someone's listening thinking they have some sort of physical limitation and wants to get moving in some way, don't know where to start, what advice do you have for them?
So I would say try like figure out what you like as far as movement because don't go for sport just because you think you could do it from a para athlete's point of view. We don't get paid that much. You need to enjoy what you do. But if you've got a sport, you're like, I really love this and I would like to pursue it at a higher level. Um, I mean, you can reach out to the Canadian Paralympic Committee. Sometimes they have Paralympian searches in Calgary and Montreal where you can go and it's kind of like you do a battery of tests and you get to see these different coaches. From a cycling perspective, if you just kind of like show up at nationals, that's usually a pretty good way to put yourself out there. And like it's, yeah, it can be daunting, but that's a good way to see where you stack up against other people and even just to get your name noticed by the coaches. A lot of times, because para sport, we want more people. Every single para athlete I know, if they see somebody who appears to have some sort of physical disability, our first thought is, I wonder if they like my sport. Can we recruit them for my sport? So if you're interested, I would just say reach out to the organization. If you know an athlete in that sport or you follow an athlete in that sport, message them, be like, who can I talk to? And we're more than happy to send your contact information to coaches, to managers, whoever it might be, because we want more. We want more
Oh,
in our
awesome.
sport.
Yeah, you're like come to the dark side of
Yeah.
something. I love it. And before we say goodbye, I want to ask you a few quick rapid fire questions. One being, who is your biggest role model?
Biggest role model is honestly 15-year-old Keely because the world fell out from under her and she kept going and allowed me to now pursue the life of my dreams.
What
The
a
time it would have been so easy for anybody else to give up, she kept going.
yes. And best advice you've ever received.
Best advice I've ever received is probably from my mom, who always say this too shall pass. No matter what's going on, good or bad, it's temporary, and all we can do is take one step forward.
Amazing. And best book or resource you'd recommend?
So, best book I'd recommend. So, this is apropos of nothing, but the book Educated by Tara Westwood is absolutely incredible. It's a nonfiction, but it reads like a fiction. It's so well written. It's about this woman who grew up in a very, very like extremist household in the States. Her parents didn't trust Western medicine. They had this like doomsday seller kind of thing. And it was her experience of trying to get out, I guess, and escaping some of the abuse that she endured in her childhood. She ended up going to, I think it was Oxford, getting a PhD and just really completely transforming her life. So it's such a powerful book. It's a great book. Again, I had to keep reminding myself that it was nonfiction. Um,
Oh, oh,
but that's definitely the one that anytime somebody comes to me, I say that one. Another really great one that I found incredible. It's a fiction. It's called When Women Were Dragons. And it's a speculative fiction book, but it is another one. It's the prose is absolutely beautiful. And I think every female should read it. Every woman should read it.
okay. Thank you. I love both those recommendations, and those are both brand new. So I appreciate it. Personal mantra or words you live by.
So words I live by, personal mantra, I actually have a tattoo of it on my collarbone. It's in omnia paratus, which is Latin for ready for anything.
Beautiful. And last but not least, for everyone who wants to follow along, watch your journey to Paris, where can they find you?
Best place to find me is going to be on Instagram. Handle is Keely Shaw 10. That's kind of where I post anything that might be of semi interest, mostly my dogs and some fun research things. But Instagram is probably the best place to find me. I try to kind of keep it up to date about where I am, what I'm doing, what the next little bit looks like. And I'm sure as we inch closer and closer to Paris, that'll start getting a little bit busier as media starts to come out and as I guess the pinnacle of sporting events draws closer.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for making time for this on top of everything that you've got going on. I appreciate it. We'll be watching, we'll be cheering, and all the best of luck for this coming season in Paris.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. It's been such a great conversation. My heart is so full.
Mine too. Thank you.